So, das ist einfach nur ein kurzer Check. Nicht mehr, nicht weniger. Vielleicht mehr oder doch weniger. Egal. Auf jeden Fall wird das hier ein ganz toller Abend noch und bin sehr gespannt, wann das bei dir losgeht, wie viel Delay wir haben, aber sind wahrscheinlich so 15 Sekunden ungefähr. Und das sollte auf jeden Fall okay sein. Genau. So sieht's aus. Sehr schön. Ich wünsche allen einen schönen Abend.
Okay. Can we start? Hello, hello. Okay, I think we can start. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, welcome to the 29th Annual Conference of the Forum for Macroeconomics and Macroeconomic Policy, abbreviated FMM. For those of you who attend this conference for the first time, let me briefly introduce the FMM. It is a research network hosted and financially supported by the Macroeconomic Policy Institute, abbreviated IMK, that's for the German wording, of the Hans-Böckler Foundation. The FMM has a steering committee consisting of 19 economists, mainly based in Germany, Austria, and the UK. There are two speakers of the committee, Jan Beringer, I'm afraid I cannot see him at the moment. There in the back, and myself, and that's why I'm giving the welcome. The FMM, moreover, comprises an international network of fellows who give their intellectual support to the network by being speakers of this conference or by contributing to our FMM working paper series. And it also consists of you taking part in this conference. We are glad that this event receives so much positive attention, with about 350 registered participants coming to Berlin from all over the world, or close to Berlin. Unfortunately, we can no longer afford to do it in Berlin. Housing prices are too high. For decades, the conference has established itself as one of the largest annual economics conferences in Europe. We are particularly proud of having received so many good papers by young economists, especially by young economists, but also, of course, excellent papers by not so young ones. But why are we so proud of the young economists contributing? Because one of our main objectives is also to bring together young and senior economists that are discontent with the prevailing orthodoxy in economics and are eager to explore new and more useful ways of doing economics. One element of this conference is therefore the tradition of organizing a pre-conference workshop, which took place this morning and this afternoon with about 200 slightly more participants. We are very grateful to Engelbert Stockhammer, Marcella Corsi, and Elissa Braunstein for having provided excellent introductory courses into post-Keynesian economics, feminist economics, and measuring and analyzing gender aspects in macro models. And we thank Jan Beringer for organizing and sharing the workshop. And if you're interested in seeing the slides of these presentations, or if you missed them, you already find these presentations online. Another element that is important to us are the 6 parallel graduate student sessions that will take place tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. Like always, they feature 24 promising papers with pressing issues in economic policy, ecological economics, but of course, in line with this year's conference topic, they also feature feminist economics, gender and care, gender and the labor market, inequality and gender. So I'm very much looking forward to listening to them, and I hope that all of you will then actively participate and contribute to feedback to these young presentations, or presentation of young ones. The broader pluralist movement of which the FMM is part has been supported by more and more people since the financial crisis. Its arguments are now discussed more widely in the academic mainstream. So that's something which we hadn't expected and we're quite proud of, yet while incorporating gender has become common in microeconomic mainstream approaches, this is less the case for macroeconomics. And this is why we wanted to focus on, in this conference, this year on this topic, and that's why we called it Gendering Macroeconomics. Intellectual and financial support stems from the Hans-Böckler Foundation, but also from INET and other donors. And that has been crucial for really being able to offer these conferences. Yet the main momentum comes from the activities of students in many countries, challenging orthodox teaching, together with the research of scholars from dissenting and heterodox traditions that have also been regulars at this conference. Now coming to this year's topics, gendering macro. What does it involve? It involves the different outcomes for men, women, and non-binary individuals of fiscal policies or crises. It involves the resulting macroeconomic consequences of gender inequalities. It's about labor dynamics, where gender wage gaps and gender employment gaps persist, unfortunately. It's about gendered and racial profiling of jobs and segregation, inequalities in the distribution of paid and unpaid work, especially in care. About policies aiming at closing gender gaps and promoting inclusive development. About intersections of globalization, climate change, and gender. So that was in the invitation to this conference. So what exactly will this conference then do, and how will it contribute to these topics? Well, here I will mainly present the plenary sessions that are taking place today, tomorrow, and on Saturday. They've been organized so as to look into the different aspects of gendering macro. In a few minutes, the first plenary session on taking stock of 30 years of gendering macroeconomics and moving forward will start. Diane Elson will inform us about 30 years of thinking on gender and macroeconomics. Elissa Braunstein will present incorporating care in economic models, a mostly macro agenda. And Özlem Onaran will discuss why we need gendered macroeconomic modeling. Miriam Rehm will be chairing the session. The second plenary on Friday, tomorrow, will present the empirics of gendering macroeconomics. It will be chaired by Til van Treek. Izaskun Duazu Bermejo, Ajit Zacharias, and Miriam Rehm will shed light on gender-biased developments and discuss how to analyze them empirically and in policy models. In the concluding plenary session on Saturday, Karen Graun, Ipek Karachan, and Margit Schratzenstaller will discuss pathways to equitable growth from a macroeconomic policy perspective. The session will be chaired by Thorsten Nicholl. Besides the plenaries, I should not forget to mention the tremendous amount of very interesting paper proposals we received for this conference. With more than 130 papers in parallel sessions, as you may have seen already in the program, the conference is almost fully booked out. And you can download the paper through the conference webpage. Yet, be aware that we are in beginning autumn with very lousy weather, as you may have noticed. So we had to make some last-minute changes to the program due to late cancellations of participations. So that's why I would really, I think it's a good idea to always check if the session will take place as it has been planned. So make sure to look at the latest developments to not then miss something you wanted to see. If some of your friends and colleagues could not make it to this conference, you may want to direct them to the live stream that we provide for the plenary sessions of this conference. And if you're active on social media, and if you want to share conference experiences, please do so by using the hashtag 29FMM on Blue Sky that you also find on your program. Moreover, similar to past conferences, we will again publish a selection of papers after the conference in a special Papers and Proceeding edition of the European Journal of Economics and Economic Policies, abbreviated EGIP, which is the home journal of the FMM. So if you just check the internet, you will see that from last year's conference, these Papers and Proceedings have just been published. And so for this conference, it will be there in 1 year from now. And this EGIP has become an open access journal since 2023, so it comes without barriers, so to say. Not yet coming to the final words, but close to it. The conference could not take place without financial support, and I would especially like to thank the Hans-Böckler Foundation for the generous financial support of this conference. Moreover, let me thank the Diane Young Scholars Initiative for providing travel grants for graduate student presenters. And we're also happy that Yafi is contributing special sessions to the conference. Something very important for the time after the presentations, dinner. Be aware that there will be 2 places where dinner is being served. One is if you leave the room directly to the right, so those who prefer to not be sitting, but rather chatting to others and moving around, I suggest to go to the right and take dinner there. It's the same what is offered in the restaurant, so if you want to sit, rather go to the left and then to the restaurant to have dinner. And please ignore that on your way to the restaurant, there's a little stand offering drinks. These are the drinks for another event, not ours. So that's you will get enough to drink, but just there or there in the restaurant. Okay. Finally, I want to thank all people involved in organizing the conference. Thanks to everyone for your effort and contribution to this conference. And finally, let me thank you all very much for coming to this conference and hopefully making it a very insightful and remarkable event. Thanks. Let's start.
Thank you very much, Heike, for opening this conference. I'm very excited to be here. And I'm very honored to be chairing such a stellar panel as this one. I'll briefly introduce our speakers. The 3 that we'll present today. We'll then have the presentations and leave the discussion to the end. So first to present will be Diane Elson. She's visiting professor at Glasgow Caledonian University, Professor Emerita at the University of Essex, former chair of the UK Women's Budget Group, advisor to UN Women, former vice president of YAFE, as you can see, an exceedingly high quality CV. I'm sure there's no need to introduce her. You would probably know her also for having received the Leontiev Prize. She, as again, I'm sure you all are aware of, works on gender budgeting, paid and unpaid work, and macroeconomic policy, among many other topics. You can check, in fact, all her publications, which she has made available on her website, open source. The second presentation will be held by Elissa Braunstein. She is professor of economics and associate dean of research at Colorado State University. She is, as I'm sure you are aware, editor-in-chief of Feminist Economics, of course, the field journal for feminist economics. She is a macroeconomist working on growth and development, macroeconomic policy with a gender focus, among, again, many other topics. As Heike was sort of reading the list of the conference, was saying all of these 3 godmothers of gender economics and gender macroeconomics have worked on all of these. As actually, in fact, Diane Elson, Elissa Braunstein is exceedingly well published. I'm running out of superlatives for this for this podium. It's really a hazard of chairing such an amazing podium that Özlem Onaran has put together, and on which she will present. Again, she will scarcely need an introduction in this format here. Özlem Onaran is an internationally renowned expert on macroeconomics and gender, professor of economics at Greenwich University, London, director of the Center for Political Economy, Governments, Finance and Accountability, and associate head of School of Accounting, Finance and Economics for Research at Greenwich University. She's a member of the policy advisory group of the Women's Budget Group in the UK, has a large number of projects with international organizations. And for her publications are too numerous to elaborate on here. She as the other two, is a senior figure in macro and gender research, as I'm sure you're all very much aware of. And so without much further ado, I'll cede the podium to Diane Elson, who will now be speaking on 30 years of thinking on gender and macroeconomics.
It's great to be here. I'm hoping to learn a lot in the next 2 days, and I'm really pleased I get my presentation over first, so then I can enjoy the rest of the conference. So I agreed to speak on 30 years of thinking on gender and macroeconomics. So I want to begin with the strategic silence of macroeconomics that was identified in a pioneering publication just over 30 years ago, edited by Isa Bakker, called The Strategic Silence, Gender and Economic Policy, including contributions from myself, from Karen Groun, who will be speaking on Saturday, and our dear friend Nilüfer Şartay, who, had she not tragically died so young in December of 2022, would have been here, I'm sure, and I'd like to dedicate my presentation to her. So the components of the strategic silence: that macroeconomics treated labor as a non-produced factor of production and households as merely consumption units. It ignored unpaid work, gender divisions of labor, and inequalities within households. And I argued that this silence underpinned macroeconomic policies that disadvantaged women, especially poor women, which I analyzed in my book on male bias in the development process. However, the silence was broken 30 years ago with this special issue of World Development in November 1995 on gender adjustment and macroeconomics, edited by Şartay, Elson and Groun. It had contributions from both feminist and heterodox economists, and it distinguished 4 approaches to gender-aware macroeconomic modeling: gender disaggregation of existing macro variables such as labor, recognition that macro parameters such as productivity and marginal propensity to consume and save are shaped by gender inequality and the gender distribution of income and other resources, the introduction of the unpaid economy, and models that combine 2 or more of these methods. And our aim was to consider not only the impact of macroeconomic policy on gender equality outcomes, but also the impact of gender equality or inequality on macroeconomic policy outcomes. So we said to people, you don't have to be interested in outcomes for women. If you're interested in the impact of macroeconomic policy, you have to think about these gender equality issues. And 3 other landmark special issues since then I just want to signal: a subsequent issue of World Development in 2000 on growth, trade and finance and gender equality, one in Feminist Economics in 2013 on perspectives on a financial and economic crisis, edited by 3 contributors to gender and macroeconomics who are not with us today, Sakiko Fukuda-Parr, James Heinz, and Stephanie Seguino. And more recently, Feminist Economics in 2022 on rethinking macroeconomic modeling of gender and care, edited by Robert Blecker and Elissa Braunstein, who very much are here today, and including contributions by Özlem and some of her colleagues. So, having introduced that, I want to briefly spend a few minutes talking about the impact of macroeconomics and narrowing this down to consideration of a citation analysis that's been carried out and is about to be published by Günzeli Berek and Ebru Konga on the rise of feminist macroeconomics, who's recognizing in this forthcoming Edward Elgar Handbook on Women and Heterodox Economics. Günzeli and Ebru examine citations in economic journals of myself, of Nilüfer Schartein, Karen Graun, of Elissa Braunstein, and Stephanie Seguino. Up to May 2024, they found there were 2,240 citations, fewer citations in economic journals than in other disciplines. Within economics, more citations in mainstream journals than in heterodox journals. And about a third of the citations in mainstream journals were those focusing on economic development. All 5 of us have worked a lot on economic development issues. But that really intrigued me. I mean, there are limitations to citation analysis, I'm not denying that, but it was very interesting to me and to others who read this, that within economics, there were more citations in mainstream journals than heterodox journals, something that gives us pause for thought. So if I turn a little bit now to the impact in heterodox journals, they found they'd included 40 heterodox journals in their analysis, which accounted for 17% of all those citations. But of those, 44% are in feminist economics. Surprise, surprise. 40% are in interdisciplinary heterodox economics journals, which have a broader canvas, and only 16% were in heterodox macroeconomics journals. So heterodox macroeconomics journals accounted for only 2% of the social total citations, and half of those were in 3 journals. I give them honorable mention here at the bottom of the slide. So that really made me intrigued. Why was this the case? And it's something I'd like to discuss afterwards in the dinner and so forth with anybody who's interested. So these are some first thoughts on why this conceptual silence in heterodox macroeconomics. After all, economists at the IMF concluded that gender equality is, quote, a macro-critical issue, although this hasn't made really any changes to IMF policy. And I think under the onslaught of the Trump government, they've stopped talking about gender now. It's a forbidden word. But my concern was what's holding back the recognition by heterodox economists, with some honorable exceptions. So I'm going to suggest that one problem may be a focus on full employment that takes for granted the supply of labor and only problematizes the demand for labor. I'm not saying we shouldn't problematize the demand for labor, of course we should, but we should also recognize that full employment does not guarantee well-being, and that unemployment does not capture many dimensions of ill-being. And there's a need to go beyond the full employment, unemployment focus and include the reproduction of the labor force and treat labor as endogenous, not exogenous. So that means we problematize the supply of labor as well as the demand for labor. So let me say a little bit more about the reproduction of the labor force. There's the reproduction of the labor force intergenerationally, which is questions about that come more to the fore now with demographic changes and falling fertility falling below replacement rate in many, many countries, but I haven't got time to talk about that today. I'm going to focus on the reproduction of the labor force on a day-to-day basis, the renewal of capabilities of what Marx called labor power, the physical and mental health, the knowledge and the skills, and the cooperative abilities of people. This requires sustaining investment of both paid and unpaid labor by private, public, household, and not-for-profit sectors. And without sustaining investment, capabilities, I'm going to argue, are depleted, reducing both well-being and output. And I would recommend you all take a look at James Heinz's book called The Economy's Other Half, How Taking Gender Seriously Transforms Macroeconomics. It is available free to download from the publisher's website. And I want to emphasize that market forces are unable to guarantee this sustaining investment. The reproduction of labor force is a contradictory and uncertain process. And now I'm going to put up this diagram because I've always been fond of what Joan Robinson called the pre-analytic vision, the understanding, before you write any equations, of how do you think the economy works and what do you think are the key components of the economy. And this is a diagram I've used quite a lot in teaching. Let's see how it goes today. This focuses on the circular flow of money, but also of labor. It argues that we look at the economy composed of 4 sectors. The private sector at the top of the diagram to signal its dominance. The household sector at the bottom of the diagram to signal its foundational position. The public sector and the not-for-profit or NGO sector in the middle as they try to counteract the dominance of the private sector and support the household sector. And this diagram suggests there is production going on in all of these sectors. The household sector is a productive sector where unpaid care and subsistence work takes place. And this is the unpaid work that's important for reproducing the labor force, for sending those little people out on the diagram, out on those arrows to supply the other sectors. And the private sector, in return, supplies money and commodities to the other sectors. I don't have time to go into all the detail of these interactions, but I do want to focus on that bit at the bottom of the slide that's called depletion of human capabilities. Because this is to signal that this circular flow isn't something that gets reproduced unproblematically. It has breaks, it has contradictions, it has crises. And one of those breaks, contradictions, and crises, one of the things that results in is the depletion of human capabilities, signaled by those 2 people lying collapsed on their sides at the bottom and not participating in the flow of labor to the rest of the economy. I want to then talk about fiscal consolidation. What happens when the public sector, in the middle of the diagram, the government decides to undertake a program of fiscal consolidation? The obvious and important immediate impact is on paid employment and income. The loss of public services and income transfers, the loss of paid employment directly in the public sector, indirectly in the private sector through multiplier effects, the loss of disposable income through reduction in income transfers and paid employment and through increases in taxes. Now, mainstream economists argue that these negative impacts are short-lived and the cuts will lead to growth through private investment. We probably all think this is a fairy tale, and heterodox economists argue that cuts don't lead to growth and that unemployment persists. Feminist economists go beyond that to argue that the loss of jobs, services, and incomes tends to affect women more than men, particularly with poor women worst affected, and also that to look at the full impact, we must go beyond the paid economy and to look at unpaid work. So if we look at the short-run impact of fiscal consolidation on unpaid work, it produces a pressure to provide more unpaid work. In volunteer work, in NGOs, to provide replacement services when public services are closed or deteriorate. In care and subsistence work in households, to stretch income further. There's a phrase in English, make do and mend. We should make do and mend, and then we'll get through this crisis. But make do and mend requires more unpaid work. To cook more from scratch, to repair clothes, for instance. And then more unpaid work to try and provide care lost from the deterioration, cuts to public services. And also things that are often overlooked, queuing to access public services and food banks. Is this unpaid work a safety net of last resort, which will be provided out of love and therefore can be disregarded by economists? It will continue, it will be provided, and this will tide us all through the bad times of the fiscal consolidation. And it's not tracked what's happening to it because of lack of regular time use surveys. nothing like the kind of timely statistics we have on paid labor. We don't have that to give the full picture of labor, both unpaid as well as paid. So then I want to identify the impact on the reproduction of the labor force and highlight the depletion of human capabilities. More unpaid work often leads to stress and physical and mental ill health for those trying to provide it. There's a very interesting recent study in the British Medical Journal which brings together and reviews a lot of the evidence on this in the recent period, I think during and since COVID, about documenting the adverse impact on women's well-being of extra unpaid work. And of course, more unpaid work cannot make good all the losses of public services, the losses of youth clubs, libraries, community services, teaching assistants, care assistants. There's a limit to the substitutability of unpaid work for paid work. And more unpaid work cannot make good all the losses of income. Child poverty increases, health, nutrition, and learning of children deteriorate. So the safety net provided by unpaid work has many, many holes. And there's no limit, and there's a limit to what can be achieved by care in an uncaring world. Well, this has long-run economic impacts. Productivity increases are held back. And productivity does matter for free time and well-being, although we have to be very careful how productivity is measured, because things that actually reduce the quality of services and intensify the exploitation of labor are often mislabeled as increases in productivity. So we certainly have to be careful about that. But I think we're interested in increasing productivity, not necessarily so we can have more, but we can spend less time producing it. Labor force participation is reduced. I don't know about other countries, but in the UK, there's been a big increase in people not in employment, education, or training, the so-called NEETs. Demands on sickness and incapacity benefits rise. Demands for health and care services rise. Cooperation is undermined. Violence and social disorder rise, as we're seeing all around Europe. Now, incorporating the unpaid economy into the analysis helps reveal the false economies of expenditure cuts that will damage economic growth and improvements in well-being. And the unpaid work, the extra unpaid work, cannot make good all of this damage. So what do we need? Better modeling of macroeconomic policy. And I think we're going to hear lots of examples of progress we're making towards that in this conference. Introduce an unpaid work sector, recognize the positive and the negative feedback effects of unpaid work on both the quantity and the quality of labor supply of both caregivers and care receivers. Recognize that labor is a produced input and requires investment to sustain its capabilities. Recognize that expenditure cuts have long-lasting, not just short-run impacts, and can permanently deplete capabilities. Recognize that spending on public services, such as health, care, and education, is an investment in social infrastructure, that will enhance productivity and growth prospects. And take a longer-run perspective. The gains from investment may not be immediate. In the UK, the Office of Budget Responsibility, which produces forecasts and monitors fiscal policy, thinks that positive multiplier impacts stop after 5 years. So anything that's going to have a longer-term impact, like many of the investments in social infrastructure, is just by assumption ruled out when making the forecasts. And treat well-being rather than full employment or GDP as the ultimate objective. So those are the kind of suggestions I want to make to you, and I'm going to make way for my fellow panelists now. I just want to say I've been drawing upon arguments and ideas that are brought together in this new book I've published on gender and development and macroeconomic policy. The introduction is new, reflecting on these 30 years of experience, and many of the chapters are all republications of somewhat hard to access papers. Is available open access, and I think it might be a resource to consider for any of you teaching these kind of courses. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane, Elson, for this overview of 30 years of thinking on macroeconomics and gender, and also putting the finger into the wounds of heterodox macroeconomics. And so I'll next open the floor for Elissa Braunstein, who will be talking to us about incorporating care in economic models, a mostly macro agenda.
This is great. Hello, everyone. Hello again to those of you who were here this afternoon. And I have to say, Miriam, thank you. This is the first time I've been referred to as a godmother of feminist economics. So I feel very happy about that. That's very cool. You know, but it also put to mind the importance, right, of the sort of the intellectual help that we get and the shoulders on which we stand. And so I'm very honored to be sitting next to Diane Elson here today, but also to see out in the audience many people who were essential to bringing me to where I am today in terms of how I think about macroeconomics. And that issue of world development, the second issue in 2000, was one that I contributed to as a graduate student. And so I got to work with Karen and Diane and Nilofer Chatai, and who you know, very much put me on the pathway that I am today. So these are my godmothers, and thank you very much for that. So I want to talk, I'm talking about incorporating care in economic models, a mostly macro agenda. For those of you who are here this afternoon too, I feel a little vulgar about this, but I'm going to proceed in the sense of talking about economic growth and in the world of sort of macroeconomic modeling. And you'll see many shades of the talk that Diane put forward, and I see this as very much a manifestation of the kinds of insights and directions that my foremothers gave to me. So I'm very much thinking about moving beyond just sort of gender disaggregating, which I think of as part of this adding women in stir approach, that you kind of differentiate between women and men and perhaps other genders, but the rest of the model is essentially the same. So I'm talking about transforming economic theory, and in particular thinking about the question of what. I know Özlem is going to be talking about why, and I actually thought that I might go after you, but I'm going before you. I mean, I think. So you'll see here, and this is when I thought that I would go after Özlem. But building on I think, you know, you can go either way, building on our panel's overview, right? Thinking about 30 years of history and breaking the silence, and we'll be talking about why we need gendered models. And I'm going to be thinking about concrete frameworks for transformation. I feel like we have theoretical tools and increasingly an empirical foundation and opportunities to fundamentally restructure macroeconomic models and really pressing to actually do the work. So I have to pause here, and we talked a little bit about this in the last session. Why model at all? And this is a feminist dilemma, but I also think it's an opportunity. There's a lot of historical skepticism, and I think well-deserved, in feminist economics around the exclusionary effects of mathematical formalism. Being abstract and complicated for the sake of being abstract and complicated, without much insight. There's also historical skepticism that is born out of acknowledging the importance that we need a diversity of knowledge creation and not all to use the same tools. And especially using those tools as a sort of form of gatekeeping, which we talked about in the last session as well. And the struggle that feminist economists have with the complexity of our lived experiences and the realities that we face every day versus, the press towards a certain abstract simplification of elegant equations that work together. I think another part of why it's been challenging to get feminist economic models is because of the rise of empirics, which has really affected feminist economics as much as it has the mainstream. We know from some work from Shiba Tijani and Sarah Small that within feminist economics itself, empirical analysis is the dominant sort of tool of the trade. And to some extent, unfortunately, I think this has left some of the work on the theoretical foundation making behind, And in that sense, I really do believe in this sort of revolutionary potential of modeling, because I see it as helping us to structure and think about our theoretical foundations. And this is because, when you engage with modeling, you are revealing hidden assumptions, like the ones that Diane talked about in terms of assuming unlimited supplies of labor. You are tasked with really specifying causal mechanisms and producing testable hypotheses, challenging policy narratives and creating new possibilities. So in all of these senses, one of the reasons that I like the struggle with models is because it makes the invisible visible and the implicit explicit. Although I have to acknowledge, for any of you have read, which all of you have, like DSGE models and things like that. I mean, nobody knows what's going on in a lot of those models. But, in that sense, I think that that's where a feminist sensibility can really help you do good work in this area, because I think it's essential for you to have to explain what's going on intuitively and to understand what's really happening inside the model. So my example of models as revolutionary tools is what Diane was talking about in terms of feminist insights into structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s, and how it revealed the hidden assumption of unlimited supplies of women's unpaid labor, and how this sort of false efficiency actually depleted capabilities and in the longer time undermined the goals of the models themselves. And, even though this may seem implicitly or obvious to many of us who think about these issues, it was really a revolutionary sort of uncovering, I think, in relation to the assumptions of these models. So thank you for that. So I'm going to now talk about the what more specifically. And I'm going to start with some challenges, some practical challenges that relate to integration. And Diane talked about some of these. I'm organizing them in a way that I think about macroeconomic models. So one has to do with reconceptualizing economic fundamentals, and importantly, and Diane talked about this, seeing GDP as a means, not an end. Right, so the traditional view is that GDP growth will implicitly bring about development success, but a capability-centered view, GDP growth and its drivers like investment and consumption and trade have results for human capabilities. Now, I'm talking about doing more than saying that, but I'm talking about what does it actually mean, or how can we sort of shift our model so that, you know, GDP growth is no longer the dependent variable, right? But it's one of the, it's on the right-hand side of the equation. It's not an independent variable, but, right, it's there because we're looking at human capabilities. So in that sense, policy evaluation depends on its impact on capabilities and distribution and sustainability. And it's the level and structure and the distribution and pace of economic growth. Now, some of you who know my work know that I've done some of this type of work, but with GDP growth as the dependent variable. It's a lot to switch the framework and have it be on the interior, but I think it's essential to go that next step. We also know, as Diane talked about in terms of time use studies, that, you know, we're missing a lot when we just talk about GDP. There have been calls for satellite accounts that include household productions. So, for instance, in the OECD, between a third to a half of total economic activity is constituted by estimates of household production. So it's not that it's this sort of satellite thing happening over there, but it's actually part of economic activity. So there's this difference between what we measure and what we miss. It's not just about identifying what we measure and what we miss, but also identifying the policy implications of that, of missing it, because economic policies based on partial data lead to partial solutions. So the second element that I want to talk about in terms of integration challenges is reformulating some of the economic variables and relationships. So one that Diane also referenced was valuing human capabilities or human capacities as investment and really extending the investment concept beyond its traditional guise of physical capital and technological innovation. Right, neoclassical economists in particular have incorporated elements of human capital. I think that that's important, but also to understand that investment, to understand and to model explicitly and intentionally human capabilities, meaning health and well-being and care provisioning, social cohesion, agency and freedom, from the perspective of, you know, that these capabilities, they have both intrinsic value and instrumental returns. And it's important to acknowledge both. So another example here, and I think Özlem will be talking about some of these, is gender-aware fiscal multipliers, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but I think this is really interesting work that how different kinds of spending on social infrastructure versus physical infrastructure, and that social infrastructure spending actually has larger fiscal multipliers in the sense of generating greater employment and tax revenue. And I think this is a really important aspect of the macroeconomic agenda. So the third thing that I want to talk about in terms of integration challenges is thinking about care as a production process and grappling directly with the questions of quality, complementarity, and substitutability. Diane talked a little bit about the limits of substitutability, and I think that's important to acknowledge. But I also think, or not but, and I also think that we could really benefit from more sort of macro model-based analysis of substitutability, and I'll talk about what I mean. So if we think about care provisioning as a production process, it has a set of inputs, time, commodities, infrastructure, institutions, norms, and social organizations. There's a care process that uses these inputs. Quality is really important, as is context. It's relational, non-separable, and time-intensive. And in terms of outputs, right, we have human capabilities, well-being, social cohesion, but also productive capacity. And one of the things that is important to acknowledge, and I know Sue Himmelwhite is here. She's been really, she helped me, her work has helped me really understand this, that unlike widgets, care quality cannot be separated from the process of provision. So in terms of thinking about care as a production process, we have to incorporate that element. We can't just sort of add care to standard production models and go from there. There's also a challenge around quality in thinking about this. There are some quality, quantity trade-offs in terms of thinking about care, time per care recipient, emotional availability, customization versus standardization, relational continuity. These all can be important. There are clear policy tensions, efficiency in terms of how much care are you providing relative to inputs versus measuring effectiveness. How do you do that? Cost containment versus quality, scale versus personalization. Diane also talked about productivity metrics. In some of the macro modeling that I've done, quality can depend on time intensity, skill, compensation. Better paid care workers typically provide, you have sort of care motivations, but also it's good to be paid well for the job that you're doing. Continuity and emotional connection also have impacts on quality. So I talked about quality in terms of integration challenges, but it's also important to think about and unpack substitutability and complementarity in the context of macro models. To what extent can the market, the state, or the community replace family care? Maybe substitutability is high, and I'm thinking, a factor, a numerical factor that can rate substitutability in routine physical care or standardized education, basic health services. Maybe it's not so high in terms of cultural transmission or emotional support, though I do get, I really love my paid psychotherapist. So, right? I mean, substitutability, maybe that's more complementary. The differences between these depend on working conditions and the needs of the care recipient, the skills of the provider in larger social contexts. I also think it's important, right, to specify complementarity. Goods and services can make care more effective or efficient. So examples, I cared for someone recently who was recovering from a very serious surgery, and we had nutritional products delivered to the house, which made caring for that person a lot easier than otherwise. They would have had to stay in the hospital. But also services like drop-in care or senior daycare centers can be thought of as complementary, right, to family care, and ways that marketization or the involvement of money in these relationships, right, can make family care more effective and even, efficient. I also, at a macro conference, it's important, I think, to address We talked about this also in the last section. How much time do I have? Sorry, I wasn't. Okay, good. Okay. So I call this the Micro Foundations Challenge, right? One of the essential pieces, especially from a macro perspective, to talk about relative to care is that it's a public good. And that's something I think that micro foundations can really miss. And it's important to engage directly with that. But there are a lot of contributions that I think micro-foundational types of models have made at the same time. Household heterogeneity matters. It gives you an anchor on which to situate how power, choice, and conflict work out, so we can have diverse household types and inter-household bargaining, life cycle dynamics and intergenerational relationships, and also how class, gender, and race and ethnicity play out, these intersections. But, you know, there's also, I don't know, decreasing returns in some way. Maybe they're increasing and then decreasing. You can get into this tractability problem where you have this model that is so complex, you don't even know how it really, you don't even understand how it really works. Computational complexity can mean it's really difficult to apply it to different situations, or you need a tremendous amount of data to do it. Parameters proliferate, and it's not reasonable anymore to estimate so many of them, and you can lose intuition. But I think there are solutions here. You know, I believe in strategic simplification, preserving key insights while maintaining analytical power. And I think we can move beyond representative agents in interesting ways in terms of grappling with issues like stratified reproduction, global care chains, how care is differentiated or the quality of care across class, and the ways that these stratified relationships can reproduce inequality. But agent-based models are also interesting in the sense that they can reveal emergent social patterns and network effects and how different norms are transmitted, as well as adaptive behavior. So in this sense, I really am advocating for a sort of methodological pluralism. Different questions require different tools, and I find some of the best to be hybrid versions of things, of models. So I encourage you to explore and experiment. And in my last few minutes, I'm going to talk about dynamic considerations. A big issue here that I think we should grapple with is demography and depreciation. Aging societies, which are affecting the world over, despite the, regardless of the level of development, means we have rising care needs, which creates labor force constraints and challenges for economic growth, as well as human capability depreciation. So in terms of policy responses that we've seen among, you know, in international financial institutions that are sort of taking up this question of demographic change, one has been to increase female labor force participation, right, to sustain the size of the workforce relative to dependence, but of course this abstracts from the question of who provides care. Another is to increase the retirement age, but to what extent are there capability limits here? Or increasing the productivity of care, through what mechanism would that happen? The last thing I want to talk about is, in terms of dynamics, is the question of development and structural transformation. And many of you know, and I know we're going to have papers on this, but in the modern era, manufacturing has had this important historical role in aggregate productivity growth because of unconditional convergence and economies of scale as well as scope. Manufacturing has really good productivity spillovers and both backward and forward linkages with domestic economies. export potential, which enables you to capture economies of scale, and also this formal employment generation, which enables a larger share of the workforce to participate in the positives of economic growth through higher wages. But as many of you also know, that with technological innovation and ongoing globalization, that manufacturing is not the employment generator it once was. So there's an emerging discussion around services and its potential and limits as a deliverer of growth. High-value segments of services like IT and finance don't produce a lot of employment. It has limited tradability, and this cost disease issue where care costs tend to rise over time relative to other sectors. And of course, this quality productivity tension. And I think India is a really good example or a cautionary tale where you get high GDP growth, but insufficient quality employment generation, and inequality increases. So there's a paradox in the sense that care is essential for capabilities, but challenging for conventional productivity metrics. There are ways to resolve this productivity paradox, and I think feminist economists are doing really good, really interesting job, and we'll hear more about this, but I think it's a really pressing development question to grapple with this in terms of incorporating and specifying the long-term capability returns of investing in care services. So care investment pays off over generations. How do we incorporate this in models and policy, as well as connecting care sector wages to social value? Okay, this is my last slide. So key takeaways. So I'm just sort of summarizing what I already talked about. Care is both intrinsically valuable and instrumentally critical. The social organization of care shapes all macroeconomic outcomes. And I think we can't address 21st century challenges, including ecological sustainability, without a care lens. I didn't get to talk about that. And so it's not just about adding variables to economic models, but about transforming how we understand economic systems. Thank you. Oh, that's it.
Thank you very much, Elissa Braunstein. It's always fascinating how much content you can pack into such a calm and equilibrated presentation style. It's very impressive. And I think we can learn a lot from these clear-sighted avenues for future research in macroeconomics and gender. And for our last presentation, I'm very happy to introduce our very own Özlem Onaran of the FMM. And she will be talking about why we need gendered macroeconomic modeling. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's a very proud moment for me to be here celebrating the 30th anniversary of Gendering Macroeconomics special issue that Diane, Elson, our friend late Nilüfer Çağatay, and Karen Groen, who is also here with us today, have edited. And I'm hoping that this will mark a new milestone that we will be celebrating in the future of FMM and post-Keynesian macroeconomics, broadly speaking. And you are part of that history, so hopefully it will go down in our collective history in the years to come. Now, I thought of my title in length, and I thought, knowing all the background that has been happening around the efforts of gendering macro in the past 30 years, I should probably ask a devil's advocate question: why bother? Who cares? So this is the background of my title. A lot of what I will be saying is based on work that we have been doing at the University of Greenwich, in the picture here, with my dear colleague Cem Oyvat, who is also here, who will be presenting at 9 a.m. tomorrow. So please do join to hear more from him. And work we have done, again, at Greenwich with Eurydice Fotopoulou. Now, on the night of the 23rd of October 2024, when we decided to devote this year's conference to gendering macro, I couldn't sleep very well. First, I counted all my feminist macroeconomics colleagues who should be invited here, and instead of counting sheep when I can't sleep. So it took a while. And then I wandered towards some unpleasant questions, inconvenient questions, I have to say, for our community. So why do we have so few macro-feminist research as opposed to micro-feminist economics, or broadly speaking, gender in labor economics, compared to feminist macro? Moving forward to more inconvenience, why some post-Keynesian economists, both men and women actually, think macro is about aggregate variables and the gender doesn't fit in well with that aggregate. At the same time, in our PK tradition, say I come from post-Kaleckian tradition, it's very normal, or the crux of our theory, that we need to look at class as an analytical variable. We do class disaggregation. We look at workers versus capitalists in our models. So why don't we do that for men and women? Or why do some post-Keynesians think it's not relevant? And of course, moving further to anger management issues, I couldn't avoid thinking, why do heterodox macroeconomists rarely cite us, feminist macro papers, even when our papers do include issues those other gender-blind macro post-Keynesian papers engage with? They write papers on balance of payments constraints. They wouldn't cite Stephanie Seguino because her paper has gender in the title. It's dropping out in some Google search, I suppose, of literature review. That's probably really bad literature review, but that's happening. We have wealth inequality in our papers. People who write on integrating wealth into PK models don't ever cite, well, because we also have gender in it. It should be better, isn't it? We do have wealth inequality and gender inequality, but no bother. Again, there are papers talking about integrating supply and demand-side interactions, endogenous technological change. Well, there are feminist versions of that too. No, they're not being cited. And Günstiliberik and Coulter have done that analysis a lot more eloquently than I'm granting about here. And of course, whenever we say gendering macroeconomics, ideas popping around are all about gender mainstreaming and gender budgeting. It is good, let's have this, but sorry, gendering macroeconomics is greater than, broader than gender budgeting. So we are certainly interested on the effects of fiscal policies on gender inequality, or equality for the better, but we're not only interested in that. We want to understand what are the effects of gender distribution and the care regime and the care deficit on the macroeconomy as well. And I'm not ashamed of trying to make a business case for gendering macro and gender equality from a purely macro perspective. Okay, moving forward, I'm going to try to take stock of the 30 years that happened since the first special issue of gendering macroeconomics in the area of feminist macro modeling. I'll ask the question, why should we do that? A little bit talk about how people, including us, have been doing that. And hopefully I'm going to end with a positive, where do we move forward from there? Some additional research questions for the students or lifelong researchers among us, and how do we then translate into a winning over policy? Okay, taking stock. A lot of this literature review is in the room, and you will be hearing from them live in the days to come. But moving from the gendering macro special issues that I have already mentioned, Diane has mentioned, in 1995 and 2000, a lot has happened. That's the good news. So we have a strand of now feminist structuralist macro, or if you like, feminist post-Kaleckian macro within the post-Keynesian tradition. These are demand-led growth models. have integrated also an endogenous supply side. Of course, Elissa's work with her colleagues, Irene van Staveren, Daniele Tavani, who is a usual regular in this conference, couldn't come this year. He has a good excuse, so he's not in my black list, but purple list, because I do resent a little bit people who were regulars who skipped this conference. Sorry, I do hold some mental lists of good and not so good stocks, but of course, Stephanie Seguino, who has been here with us before, her work has been very influential in shaping our work with Jem and Eurydice in terms of developing our feminist Kaleckian model. Moving forward now, what is for me very exciting is models that bring together that structuralist feminist analysis with learnings from ecological macro models, particularly that try to dig deeper into different types of public spending, integrating the care sectors, but also the green sectors and physical or rest of the infrastructure. Again, Karen Groen and her colleagues are doing really important work around that. I'm happy to maybe do a little bit of spill of some news to come, but Sergi Floro and Karen are working on a book to come. Hopefully, I put here a date. You don't have to live up to that date, Karen, but we are looking forward to that. Of course, Jem and I have been exactly trying to integrate that purple and green interactions. And again, an advertisement for 9 a.m. session tomorrow. Our PhD student, Yasmin Lucas, who is also here, will be speaking on the new work we are doing around synthesizing these green and care sectors analysis. There is a other strand within gendered macro modeling that looks at input-output analysis. In a way, Yasmin Lucas's work is now falling there as well. That goes back to the work that Rania Antonopoulos and colleagues have been doing at Levy Institute, İpek İlkaracan and colleagues. Again, Jerome Dehonau, Sue Himmelwhite, who are both here today, have been working on this input-output based analysis. İpek İlkaracan, Kijong Kim, Ajit Zacharias, Emel Memiş, and Thomas Mesterson, and I have to say who are all here, have brought that a further stage, integrating input-output macro analysis with micro household data analysis, and on top of that, time use integrated analysis. And they have coined the term, in addition to poverty or gendered analysis of poverty and employment, an analysis of time poverty. So I'm sure they will be talking more about that in their own presentations. And moving again further beyond the real economy limited macro modeling, again, Ajit Zacharias, Gennaro Zeza, and Tom Masterson have now integrated in a stock flow consistent analysis, financial sector and balance of payments sector, which are very important questions in the global south, but also in the global north. Again, an advertisement for a session on Saturday. Grazzini, Cara Grazzini and her colleagues have a similar balance of payments integrated gendered macro analysis. So I hope you go there and hear Cara talking more about that. In a separate strand, feminist economists have done also very well in bringing some real-world realism into conventional CG, computable general equilibrium models. Here Fontana and her colleagues have done excellent work. The common feature maybe of all this 30 years of feminist macro is integrating some important realistic structural features of the economy, including the gendered structure, and looking at public infrastructure going beyond the conventional physical infrastructure, integrating the care or the social infrastructure, looking at distribution, bringing it in, a gendered analysis of bargaining power, not just in the market economy, but also in the household. These are important extensions to the conventional structuralist futures that we know in the post-Keynesian or structuralist tradition that would look at oligopoly power, sectoral structure, or issues around import dependency. So having taken all that stock, I will try to summarize the why question, or the answer to the why question, around 5 key reasons. Well, the first has been elaborated very well by both Diane and Elissa. Labor doesn't grow on trees, it needs to be reproduced, and the care economy is a key sector of the economy, just as the traditional structuralists thought manufacturing is a key sector. And that should include an analysis of not just the paid care work, but also the unpaid domestic care work. The second reason is the social norms, and anyone who attended today to Marcella Corsi's excellent introductory lecture knows that social norms are sticky. They do determine gender division of labor. They do determine behavioral differences between men and women. Men workers versus women workers would have different behaviors, and that's not just about inequality, they will have repercussions about macro outcomes. The third reason is the effects of all that on things we care, like the well-being, or a business case for care economy, the effects of that on productivity, on the labor supply, again on the supply side of our models, or on the demographic change, population growth, or fertility, all important supply side variables. You're not going to adequately understand the supply side if you don't gender your macro model, and you will not be able to talk about demand and supply interactions if you don't have gender as an analytical category. You will not have a good analysis of fiscal policy effects or even industrial policy effects. Breaking news for you, multipliers are gendered. There's not one single multiplier. And I should maybe add, one of the regulars of this conference once had told me, we have big challenges of productivity. We are not going to talk about the care economy here. China is beating us in the productivity race. I was speechless, honestly. Yes, it is true. Europe has a productivity issue. Well, if you want to deal with that, industrial policy has to talk about things that may sound mundane as childcare, early childhood education, nursery teachers, their pay, their working conditions. So you have to gender your industrial policy design. Distribution is a very key concept for PK, post-Keynesian macro. Well, distribution needs to be gendered because jobs are gendered and there is racial profiling of jobs. So intersecting inequalities is a key component of an adequate analysis of distribution of income and wealth. Last but not least, we have been talking in this conference a lot about intersecting, interrelated, multiple crises. This has a climate action need. It also has a care need. So we need to, if we will have proper ecological macroeconomics, which we proudly have in every parallel session, at least in one session in this conference at FMM conferences, well, we need to gender ecological macroeconomics too. So that's my green, purple, red alliance of an eco-feminist, post-Keynesian synthesis of macro. If you don't do that, if you omit gender and the care economy at your own peril, it will be an omitted variable bias, as we know in econometrics. An omitted variable bias is poor econometrics, and it will also lead to poor policy analysis, I'm sorry to break. So, going then to my 5 points, we should start by having a care regime as part of our growth regime analysis if we want to properly gender macroeconomics. So we should ask questions like, what's an optimum care regime? That should include things around childcare as well as education. It should talk about health, of course, but it should also talk about long-term care of the elderly or the disabled. We should talk about who cares, what is the paid or unpaid element of care work, and how is that gendered in terms of its distribution? Who is paying for care? Is it public provision or private provision? If the latter, is it formal or informal? If it is public provision, is it taking the form of universal public provision of care services, or are they giving baby bonuses such that women continue to do that as part of their gender division of labor in the domestic sphere? What are the conditions of the care workers, the carers, and what are the conditions of the one who is being cared? That goes back to the quality discussions that Elissa was making. What is the labor market structure in terms of paid working hours? How does that affect provision of care and the distribution of that? What is the situation about the location of where we work for pay? Are we working from home? Are we working close to home? All these parameters that will define a care regime will have crucial implications on productivity, on fertility, in terms of long-term demographic implications. It will have also political implications. I'm not going to dwell long on that because İpek İlkaracan in the final plenary will talk about her joint work with EASE, where they do find that if you rely on things like baby bonuses, pronatalism, women doing most of the care, you end up with authoritarian regimes. So if anyone is not convinced with that, I would refer everyone to also read Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, or you can watch the show with 6 seasons, which I recently completed. She calls it, it's not science fiction, it's actually non-fiction. It has happened, sadly, and it is happening again. So, the second point, we need to gender macro-behavioral analysis because the existing gendered social norms means we have different marginal propensities to consume. What we found with Gemma and Eurydice is that women's marginal propensity to consume in the care economy is larger than that of men, but then men tend to consume more in the rest of the goods and services compared to women. Stephanie Seguino and Sergi Floro were saying this is because women face more uncertainty. They tend to save more. But when it comes to things that improves households' nutrition outcomes, healthcare outcomes, education outcomes, women actually, the shop is yours. They open their purses. Now that means if you put more income in the hands of women, it leads to more spending in goods and services that improve the health and education outcomes. Well, that directly translates into labor productivity outcomes. This means if you spend in sectors which would predominantly hire women as the government, say in the care economy, you would end up, given the occupational segregation, hiring more women. Well, that would not only have gendered effects on employment, but it would also have different consumption effects, different productivity effects. Hence, supply side as well as the multiplier is gendered. So on that third level of gendering the supply side multiplier, we have to talk about, of course, gendering infrastructure. And here I was planning to rant a little bit about the orthodox Marxist analysis that in the 21st century today is still thinking not-for-profit public paid care workers are unproductive because of some 19th century fundamentalist understanding, reading, religious reading of Karl Marx. I'm sorry to say, but feminist economists who do come from, at times, from Marxist backgrounds, don't deny that background, some of whom are in this room today, Diane, Sue Himmelwhite, UK Women's Budget Group, have moved on with that. We do acknowledge care work is productive work, therefore we advocate for calling public social sector as a care sector as an infrastructure sector and a productive sector because it has both direct and indirect impact on productivity. It leads to healthier and more educated and more socially talented, I have to say, workforce. It does relieve women from providing care if it is underprovided socially, and their increased labor force participation may contribute to aggregate productivity in the economy. Otherwise, the care work will be being done invisibly, unpaid in the domestic sphere. İpek İlkaracan has therefore called that sector purple sector, and I'm wearing purple in that direction today. So what we need to understand is all these infrastructure extension or incorporating social infrastructure into our understanding of infrastructure. Of course, that would also apply to the caring of the elderly or the frail. They're not going to come back to the labor market, but it does contribute to our social fabric. It does make us more innovative, more secure, and thereby more productive. So what we did to address these in a macro model, and it is a very aggregate macro model, it's gendered, but there is a lot to extend in that model. Again, a call to the PhD students in the room to do that. Cem Oyvat, Yurdisi Fotopoğlu, and myself, we have said productivity is endogenous in the rest of the economy, in the non-care sectors. It's changing as a function of the wage rate, the aggregate output, but also public spending in both the social infrastructure and the physical infrastructure. Of course, it changes with private investment. It does change with also what the households do in terms of how they spend, in terms of the care spending, but also what they do with their unpaid care work. That would have dynamic implications for unit labor costs that in turn will feed into private investment, because private investment is about, well, unit labor costs. If you're more productive, your unit labor costs will be lower. It does affect net exports, and it does affect your balance of payment constraint. It relaxes your balance of payment constraint if you invest today in the care economy. Of course, on the supply side, it's a very important determinant of labor force participation of women, but also men. And of course, it's important for population growth. It is growing on social infrastructure. When women don't want to become unpaid care workers, they stop caring and they choose not to have children. So it does have actually long-term implications on population as well. Here, of course, it's not just the supply or the quantity of labor, but it's also the quality of labor that is affected by the provision of care. And of course, if we are interested in what's going to ultimately happen to employment in our macro analysis, we need to know what's happening to both the demand side and the supply side when you pull these levers. And last but not least, the provision of public social care infrastructure, or for the worse, the lack of that, will have important effects on how gendered the sectoral distribution of employment is. We have an occupational segregation in our models in different sectors. Of course, care economy is very women-dominated, but we say in extensions of that model, this is endogenous. If we hire women in the care economy, pay them decent wages, offer them decent career prospects, I'm sure men would want to queue to get education and training to apply to care jobs as well. So all these things can change. Social norms are endogenous. I had these nice graphs, but I'm going to just jump to that. So what you do in terms of public spending in the care economy has short-term effects on demand and employment. It does have effects on wages and bargaining and distribution. And in the long run, it does have important effects on labor productivity. In the same way, if you provide jobs that would hire women or offer opportunities to women, say in the export zones, but you undersupply paid, high-quality social infrastructure, care infrastructure, well, who's going to care for the people? You would be squeezing unpaid care by making women work for pay, but that squeezing unpaid care will come and bite you in the labor productivity in the long run in terms of less productive children who haven't been adequately cared for. So if you're trying to draw women to the labor market in export zones, you have to complement that by the provision of childcare services adequately with a high quality. So that would give me our analysis of the multiplier. Good news, multipliers are large. Well, we know that. Keynesians know that. Now we need to get to gendering them as well. So we do find in our work with GEM, both for emerging economies as well as for a high-income economy, Britain, very strong effects of public spending in the care economy, in social infrastructure, as well as the green economy, on both the demand and supply side. Very strong effects on GDP and employment. So, for example, just to give you a number, you get in the UK, from the care economy, a multiplier of 3.6. If you contrast that with public gross fixed capital multiplier, it's lower, 2.4, still quite high, but lower. The care multiplier is higher because it's affecting not just the level of demand, of consumption and investment, but it's also affecting, in a positive way, the composition of how we consume. Something I said earlier about the marginal propensity differences. On the supply side, again, quite remarkable effects. That should be important for productivity and investment and net exports, which we do find they are. If you increase in Britain public spending in the care economy by 1 percentage point of GDP, you end up creating 4.6% more productive rest of the economy outside the care sectors. That effect is surprisingly smaller for physical gross fixed capital formation. Of course, the time effects of these effects are very different, and again, a research question for the students in the room to explore further. What components of spending in childcare versus other components of care, in which dimension affects the supply side? I think very interesting questions. But despite these strong productivity effects of care infrastructure investment, we have some fascinating employment effects overall. Again, for Britain, with care spending, we would be able to increase employment by 1.5% in total. The share of women in that total employment increases if you spend in the care economy. So, fiscal policy is one of the biggest equalizers, the most effective way of creating employment. And we come from a tradition that talks a lot about what is the effect of distribution on output and employment. We did that for understanding the effect of gender distribution. I'm going to say we have coined the term, we acknowledge the dual role of wages in general and dual role of wages of women as well. So it's not just a demand stimulator, but it's also a cost. So we say the economy could be gender equality-led or gender inequality-led. It's a general model in the good spirit of Keynes's theory. We should say empirically for the UK, we did find the UK is both class-wise wage-led and gender-wise gender equality-led. We coined the term equality-led. All good news, but the bad news is with changing distribution, you get only a small little bit of demand stimulus. You get, however, positive news, great productivity stimulus. Bring it together, what will happen to employment? It's not going to increase. So if you want full employment, genuinely, a very Keynesian goal of macro policy, you need to bring in fiscal policy and put your money where your mouth is, particularly because productivity effects are very strong in the medium run, and the demand effects of tweaking, leaving things just to distribution and private sector or minimum wage tweaks will not deliver the demand that you need for full employment. So, gendered multiplier. I have already said a few things, but what is the good thing about gendering the multiplier? It shows you that public spending is partly self-financing. So if you increase public spending, your primary budget balance as a ratio to GDP will not increase one-to-one. It will increase because it's not magic. It's only partially self-funding, but it will increase less than one. And that's a reference to a great compendium that Karen Groen has been editing at Brookings Institute. So the table was made by her push. So credit to her. The effects on the UK are very strong. So actually care public spending is more than self-financing because we have so high multipliers. The physical infrastructure spending in the UK, it's also self-funding, but it would still lead to some increase in public debt to GDP. So you're gonna need to tax and do something else if you're concerned about it. With the emerging economies, the table refers to that 8 other countries we worked on with Jim. The self-financing is less, fiscal space is narrower, it's still there. And if you can see the numbers for South Korea, again, care economy is more self-funding, and it's closer to Britain. But the good news is in all of these economies, it's still at least partially self-funding, meaning public budget deficit to GDP ratio is not going up 1-to-1 when you increase spending. Right, so we need to, fourth point, adequately gender the distribution part of our analysis. What we did, again, in our model with GEM is to think of wage bargaining as a function of employment right of men and women and with spillovers from each other's wages. They have different bargaining powers, and thereby you need to think about that wage bargaining as a separate gendered relationship. There's, of course, racial profiling of jobs. Those analyses need to be furthered with that intersectionality. A lot of people often tell me there is no gender pay gap crisis, glass ceilings are partly broken. Well, yes, but the sticky floor is persisting, and it's actually much more important that occupational segregation at the bottom of the distribution, particularly in the care economy, jobs done by women, by migrants, by racial minorities, is very important if you want to understand an adequate analysis of class distribution from a gender lens. Of course, all these things are endogenous. They can be changed. They can be changed by policies, taxation, or public spending. And it's therefore important to understand how they would influence demand and supply side analysis. In another analysis, thanks to a comment from Diane with my colleague Alex Kushansky, who will be also here tomorrow speaking, we find that actually wage share is likely to be lower in sectors where we have a higher share of women. That means trade unions also should get their act together and probably think how they can give a muscle bargaining power to women. Last point, why do we need to gender macro models? Well, if we want to really understand and provide solutions to the intersecting and interacting crises in care and climate, we need to properly have a purple-green macro gendering ecological macro effort to arrive at what I call an ecofeminist post-Keynesian macro model. This is in a way trying to move from what Rebecca Diskey calls a careless economy towards a green and caring economy. That would require, as I said before, for the public sector to put their money where their mouth is. Then that would require moving beyond competing, investing in care versus investing in the green economy. We need to do both, so we need a new paradigm in fiscal policy, which we call a needs-based fiscal policy. Of course, purple and green are complementary in their own ways. Again, Ipek will talk more about that in the closing session. But if you're worried about technological change and artificial intelligence taking jobs, we are, again, there to understand these complementarities and what the purple and green sectors are there to offer to us. I will skip the number crunching that we have done, promising a positive alternative to decarbonization and redeployment away from fossils towards those green and care economy and other infrastructure jobs via a public sector investment mobilization. The good news is there are a lot of new jobs we can create. And I always get asked, well, how do we fund that? Good news, as I said, there is money, multipliers are high, and they are gendered. But we need to talk about progressive taxation of both income and wealth. Again, a topic for the closing plenary for Karen. We need to talk about how do we extend our space for borrowing Women's Budget Group has been for long advocating how we redefine infrastructure, extending it to public social care infrastructure such that we can rely on some form of fiscal credibility while still borrow if need be. And of course, there's a lot to gender in our discussions of national investment banks, how those development banks can be mobilized to serve for also creating investment in the care economy. And last but not least, we have to open the Pandora's box and talk about gendering monetary policy with targets of full employment and inflation in a dual fashion while delivering those needs-based priorities. And I'm very happy to hear that there are quite a few papers gendering monetary policy in this session. We have been, I think, better in gendering fiscal policy in the 30 years, less so in the monetary policy, and there are great papers at this conference. So please do submit your articles to the European Journal of Economics and Economic Policies, such that in 30 years we can celebrate that special issue. Thank you so much, and there are some differences. And please wait for the mic because it's being live streamed for. Sorry to go.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah, thank you very much. We've now switched the microphone successfully. Thanks very much for this tour de force of the why and how of gendering macroeconomics, Özlem, Onaran. And that means that we will be now moving to the discussion part and the Q&A part of tonight's plenary session. As Özlem just rightly said, the microphones will be moving around the room, so if you have any questions to our panel, please feel free to raise your hand and ask them.
Yeah, we have like half an hour, so we have half an hour, so it should be okay.
Who is willing to break the ice, please? We have a few questions here at the front.
Thank you for these great presentations. It was a pleasure to listen to all three of you. Diane started off saying that, suggesting that one of the reasons for why heterodox macro doesn't pick up much on feminist macro may be due to their demand side focus, the full employment focus. And then Özlem brought in the demand side and the full employment intersections with recent feminist macro work. So my question is whether you think that may be the bridge, and I will argue in the closing plenary that that has the potential to be a very strong bridge, bringing the heterodox macro and the feminist macro policy agendas together. All the findings on the ability of investing in care services with the large employment multipliers and the ability to generate jobs superior to other kinds of investments, whether that could be our bridge, connecting bridge, overlapping bridge to the heterodox macro agenda.
Thank you. Would you just pass the micro? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you also very much for this presentation. I really learned a lot and many questions, but one number I was really astonished when I think it was you, Özlem, who said that a 1% increase in public expenditure for care leads to an increase in productivity of 4.6%. And that's really an astonishing number. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the effects, how this comes about?
Thank you. I have another question just so you, yes.
All right, thank you for the wonderful presentation. My name is Dr. Freeman from the Great University of Johannesburg in South Africa. So my question is, we are living in a world that is shaped by geopolitical events. Therefore, what is the transmission mechanism that is required by developing countries to develop and implement gender-inclusive macroeconomic policies? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move back to the podium. I leave it to you how you want to start. Everybody's still finding that. And you want to start? Yeah.
Well, let me take the last question about developing gender-inclusive macroeconomic policy in South Africa and other African countries. There is actually a lot of work going on in Africa on this by African feminist economists and those working with them. So there are huge forces, ranged against this in terms of the forces that are, as in many countries, pressing for austerity policies, pressing for servicing the debt before anything else. But there are now quite a lot of feminist economists in Africa who are working on those issues. So maybe we can talk and I can give you some names of people you can contact.
Thank you. You want to speak about the bridge?
Sure. So in terms of the bringing the demand and the supply side together, I think that's a very interesting proposition in terms of this, bringing the heterodox and macro and feminist macro perspectives together. One aspect that I think is missing from that is that I've also felt like the heterodox in terms of the building up of human capabilities, right, doesn't focus enough on the supply side, right, and the different, how I talked about, at least neoclassical economics has this notion of human capital, and that it is essential in creating productivity, for instance, and that you can get productivity improvements from investing in human capital in a completely orthodox framework. I still think that there is resistance to thinking about labor, producing labor power as productive and adding to long-term productivity growth. And so that is a challenge, I think, that remains unaddressed. And so I'd be interested to hear what you had to say about that, and maybe that segues right into what you were talking about in terms, or the question that you got about the 4.6% in productivity growth. So why don't you start there? I'm interested.
Yes. Okay. I can tell you how we get that number, and I can tell you what further research that we have to, or PhD students in the room hopefully will be doing around that. So what we do is we take the panel data of all the sectors in Britain, apart from the care sectors, so health and education left out. The rest is in the panel data, and we regress productivity, output per hours of work in each of these sectors over 50 years of data, taking long-term averages or long-term differences and so on usual determinants of productivity from a Keynesian Kaldor-Verdon perspective, and add to that not just the sector's own private investment, but also public investment in the economy in aggregate, in two separate areas. One is the care spending of the public sector. Well, it is dubbed as you know, current spending. We call it social infrastructure or care investment by the public sector. It's simply your current spending by the government in health and social care and education sectors, all aggregated. And public gross fixed capital formation. these are same variables for all the sectors. Elissa knows it very well because it got published in Feminist Economics and in a different extension with wealth effects in Cambridge Journal of Economics too. We care for usual econometric issues of endogeneity, using instrumental variables and all that. And then we look at what is the effect of public spending on productivity. And then there is the whole macro simulation going on, because whatever public spending is happening is, of course, affecting the aggregate output in the economy. It is affecting different types of spending, it's affecting productivity, it's affecting employment. So combine all these simulations and you get it's not just one econometric estimation, but using those parameters and other sides of the full estimation of the model, where we have obviously consumption effects coming from government spending of the households in different sectors, hence the gendered multipliers. There are different investment effects. There are effects on net exports. Put all these together, we get the 4.6%, which is very high. The why is all blah, blah, blah, hence speculation. It's not unimportant. I'm not looking down on the idea of conceptually, I think, trying to understand what are the channels, but I think this is where I really would like to see new research being done. Micaela Fernandez, who is in the audience as well, our PhD student, hopefully is interested in looking at that and also comparing the global north and the south. No pressure, Mika, you have all the time, 4 years ahead of you to come up with the numbers and present here, but I'm very interested in understanding the time differences, childcare. The effect of that has an immediate effect on women, because I would be able to go and work, and that would probably increase aggregate productivity in the rest of the economy if I don't have to provide supervisory childcare at home. Provided that I have enough time still to provide emotional care for the child, because otherwise you won't get a socially talented person growing up. On the other hand, the impact of childcare provision by the government would have, or early childhood education will have tremendous effects 20 years on those children. There is very interesting anecdotal evidence around that forthcoming, I should say. Ignacio Pinto is writing a policy brief for Women's Budget Group, looking at how public spending on childcare does lead to better outcomes. But this will be a 20-year horizon. Whereas if you provide better healthcare, you would get immediate effects, obviously. What is the effect of long-term elderly care? That is, again, very complicated. It is likely to be very short-run and immediate for those people who would otherwise have to be caring full-time, again, supervisory care for the elderly if there is not adequate provision of social care. But there are very sophisticated, I think, impacts that would come from knowing, as an adult person who doesn't need elderly care, who is also not caring for another elderly person, if I know I will be cared for, I would be a more secure person, and hopefully we would have a stronger social fabric. These are all words from Diane, by the way, who has very eloquently written all that. We have not empirically pinned these effects down, and I think this is moving forward. We have to make a stronger case for business case of care is productive work. You've got to invest in care, otherwise you're not going to have a productive economy or an industrial policy. To do that, I believe in the power of numbers. Well, we have one aggregate number, but your question is spot on the how question. Yes, I would like to say a few things on the global inequalities dimension of that, but I think I will just say we need to think about international policy coordination and opening the fiscal space in the global south, and that requires talking about tax coordination, capital controls, debt cancellation, an active technology transfer in the form of development aid, But also, we should stop doing austerity here. That alone will extend the fiscal space in the global south. But of course, very important issues there.
Elissa, you want
So
to add to
can
this?
I just one follow-up to what Özlem was saying? I mean, it's really interesting to hear you talk about the specification, and you know, I hate to be sort of a defender of neoclassical macro, but you know, to just note that endogenous growth models where technological innovation is endogenous and it's directly dependent on education investments in human capital. I mean, you have models that exist which are consistent with something like this. So that's another, you know, I think reason to approach this from a hybrid perspective. Like, we don't need to invent everything. There's some really good work that already exists, right, which is consistent with the kind of thing that you're talking about, as well as investing in early childhood education, right? We know that there has been tremendous work that Karen Groen and others have facilitated. I can't think, my jet lag is coming to me, but so I can't think of this person's name. But there is a body of empirical work that has looked over time at the returns to investments in early childhood education. So,
Thank you.
what's that? Yes, thank you, James Heckman. Who does really great work around this issue. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for another round of questions, and you need to put your hands up very clearly. The lights are very bright, so please, we have one here at the front.
Simon Wong.
Hi, thank you very much. I've got a question that's for all three speakers. You've talked engagingly and very well about gendering macroeconomic policy and gendering macroeconomic models, but none of you have talked about gendering macroeconomic theory. Is that because you think theory and models are the same thing, or is there some other reason?
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Yes, please. There's another one on the right. My right. Yes, it's coming.
Thank you. I just want to ask that, because you guys talked about the past 30 years and the progress gender has made, now with upcoming populist regimes globally, right-wing and religious governments, how do you see the next 30 years? Will the progress on gender actually advance, or will we backtrack on some progress that we've made? We've already seen US pulling out of development with the US aid and a lot of gender programs, and how Trump talks about gender. I mean, it's embarrassing. So yeah, your perspective on the next 30 years, can you do some predictions? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We could take a third question if there is one. Yes, please, at the front.
Hi, just a quick question. Following up on the 30 years and the gloomy outlook. Feminist economics is also coming out of the women's peace movement, so we should integrate our thinking about gender, feminist economics, and war and conflict resolution.
Thank you very much. So I'll move back to the podium now. Do you want to start?
I can start, yes. Thanks for the final point on bringing in a feminist perspective to peace. It was actually something I wanted to say. It was in my slides, and I had to rush over that and didn't mention. But a feminist, ecological, post-Keynesian agenda would also mean that, well, some things will grow: renewable energy, care economy, public transport, and it leads to a lot of demand and a lot of activity. But if you're serious about climate change, some things have to degrow too. And of course, I have a list of wish list of things to degrow. I'm not interested in what will happen eventually to GDP, but I'm interested in what's happening to emissions. So in addition to fossil fuel sector, Of course, the military-industrial complex is something for me that needs to degrow. That takes a very different twist now with all the, of course, military powers making us watch wars on live television every night in the news. It has taken a very different turn after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, you know, looking back to genocide in Palestine, again, we have to stop producing and exporting these weapons. To Israel, we have to really degrow military weapons. And if you still have some need for defense, it has to probably rely on a lot more, you know, defense as opposed to offensive weaponization. So it is very much in the spirit of a feminist ecological utopian thinking for me, talking about demilitarization or degrowing that sector. Of course, the pronatalism that comes in this new era of authoritarian regimes, that's really going back to the worst nightmares of our history. And hence, for me, I think public provision of care as opposed to baby bonuses is one of the key issues around that. Or talking about okay, it may sound a little bit technical now, but endogeneity of gender norms and endogeneity of occupational segregation, because gender norms are socially constructed. Gender is a socially constructed term. It's not a biological term. All these are very important, and it took almost a new revolutionary meaning when you have Trump, who is really making the life of people working in publicly funded areas a nightmare, because the word gender all of a sudden became the most illegal word that you can use in the US. And we often say in Turkey, the Turkish neoliberals wanted to make Turkey small America, and we're saying, oh, now Trump is making America a big Turkey. So it's not like a big surprise or something that I have never seen in my personal life as a person born and bred in Turkey, but yes, it's back into the forefront, ranging from Hungary to Turkey to the US and or Russia for that matter. Okay. Simon, I think it's fair to say people talk from their experience. I'm a person with interest in producing models that can be tested. And that's my liking. So I found there was a tone of a bit of too much criticism, I think, undertone in your question. So I will not answer, but I talked from my experience. You might think about it too much, reducing theory to models, but yeah. I won't apologize for that, because someone needs to model and then test them, and that's a useful way of theorizing, I believe.
Thank you. Diane, do you want to continue? Yeah.
Okay, I'll go next. I wasn't totally sure what you had in mind, Simon, but one of the things you might have had in mind was something we didn't talk about. It's true, although I think all of us have written stuff about it elsewhere, which a system which is dominated by finance, how the tension between that and the issues to do with the reproduction of labor that we've been talking about, and the tremendous mismatch, and that's, I slightly talked about it, pointed to, and I talked about the contradictions, a mismatch in terms of time, fundamental differences in the modalities of time in the reproduction of labor. It's not reversible time in the reproduction of labor. In money markets, everything, flows are reversible. When you're talking about reproduction of labor, they're not. So there's a huge the mismatches that we've already talked about in terms of time scale. A day is a long time in the financial markets, but a day is a tiny speck of time in the human life. So there's a huge mismatch there in terms of time frames and time horizons for decision making. And risk, I think, the issues of risk, which also links to reversibility, the fact that and here there's obviously parallels with ecological thinking about the kinds of that are not reversible, that are not recoverable. And there's obviously a huge mismatch between those kind of concerns and the way that financial systems operate and the intensification of the dominance of finance. And Nilofer and I we do have a diagram that tries to capture a little bit of that in an article in the second issue of the World Development 2000, but we didn't elaborate it a lot, but there's one of the chapters in the Reader that I've just brought out, which is a republication of an article about these issues of risk and who bears the risk if you compare how the financial systems operate with how labor is reproduced. And Jeff Powell and Jeff is a colleague of Özlem's at Greenwich, have just had an article accepted by Feminist Economics on engendering monetary policy, where we're trying to grapple with some of these things. So if your question, Simon, was about this issue of how do we understand how these real, the financial forces and the power of finance and the way that constrains and shapes the kinds of investment that are forthcoming, of the kinds that we've talked about, and how they constrain that and how they destroy the possibilities of that. I think that's an important question, and I think there is work going on that.
So thank you for responding in terms of theory versus modeling, but I think to pick up, and maybe this will also be a bit of a response to that, to pick up the question about autocratic regimes and making predictions about the next 30 years, I certainly won't do that. But I think, that fundamentally, and this is, I've done some of this work theoretically, thinking that underlies the macroeconomic model is thinking about patriarchy, right, as a system of production and reproduction that long predates capitalism and interacts with it in both complementary and contradictory ways. So for instance, in other work that I've done, thinking about patriarchal production as a continuum and complicating some of what I presented this afternoon before this panel, but you have a sort of more gender egalitarian distribution of the responsibility for social reproduction. But then on the other side, you have a more patriarchal one that can manifest in a couple of ways. One is through this feminization of responsibility and obligation, where women as a class are taking up the time and financial costs of social reproduction. But another manifestation is traditional patriarchy, right? Where in exchange for maintaining traditional sources of male power, there's also, to an extent, a fulfillment of the traditional patriarchal obligation to the social reproductive side of the economy, right? In the sense of the baby bonds that you were talking about, or traditional marriage where women, right, stay home, and there's a traditional sexual division of labor where women provide social reproduction time, but men provide the financing. And so I see that, patriarchal benefits and costs manifests in these different ways, and is very much, I think, a theoretical stance on the macro manifestations of relations between genders.
Thank you very much. We would have time for one very quick round. If there's important questions, I have one hand there, so please. Maybe 1 second if you want to think about it very quickly.
Thank you. I don't think this is working.
Please, go ahead.
So I wanted to ask that, since we've been talking now about practice more than theory, and I can't help but think, as a woman from Pakistan, that all these countries, Iran, Afghanistan, Sudan, India, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, I could keep naming them, right? Do you guys consider these as outliers and they're eliminated from the practical theories? Or no disrespect intended, but is this another instance of white feminism where whatever goes on in the global south is irrelevant and we continue discussing? Because these topics have not, or these countries, and Afghanistan, for instance, Iran, for instance, they've pushed women back to the Stone Ages, and none of the migration agencies, none of the refugees agencies have adequately put in action what's going on in Sudan, how women were treated in Palestine. None of this sort of, when I look at it as a woman from Global South, it seems like nobody in the Global North cares. So what would your perspectives be on that? And how do we then talk about macroeconomics and gendering and inclusivity if the conditions in the Global South keep deteriorating and the North keeps improving, however, whatever? It's not very, I'm still thinking out loud, so I hope you guys understand the question and the place that I'm coming from. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And one final question at the front.
I have a question that came up to me while you were talking, and I mean it positively. A key question would be, if it could be positively answered from a gender perspective, or feminist perspective, is patriarchy growth enhancing in history, in the present, in developed societies, in underdeveloped societies? My first approach would be patriarchy, or less patriarchy, is growth enhancing. However, when we have, because of labor market participation of women, however, in modern societies we have not the same labor participation of men and women, but quite similar in the meantime. So can we say it still today, say for the German or British economy, that less patriarchy is, or gendering the economy, is growth enhancing?
Thank you.
Yes or not? And so for developing countries, I suppose it is quite different and very clear cut.
Thank you. I have a promise of a very short question to your left. Am I right? Yes.
Thank you. I mean, you've been talking a little bit about how difficult it has been to engender macro, especially from a heterodox tradition. I feel that through orthodox tradition, it has been a little easier even.
Yes.
And I don't know, just maybe I want to hear some final comment on, like, I feel this is a great opportunity for us, really. This kind of could be a turning point. So what can be said to the audience, heterodox economists, on if they're not there yet, like on how they can use this conference to think a little bit more on how to engender their own work and not only know how we've been engendering it. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we move in reverse order? Elissa, do you want to start?
Sure.
Thank you.
So I'll take the last one, the last question. I think first, I think that I think taking labor as a produced means of production, for me, is a key place to start in terms of heterodox. The question about is patriarchy growth enhancing or growth inhibiting, I think it depends. It depends on the structure of the economy and its context in the global economy, right? We have instances in feminist macro work where patriarchy can be very complementary to growth, right? The work of Stephanie Seguino and how gender wage gaps and the crowding of women into certain economic sectors constitute a competitive global advantage for export-oriented economies, right? So that really contributes to economic growth. But then in later stages of development, inequality in labor force participation and health and education, right, really detract from growth. So it really depends. In that sense, right, that's another reason I think it's important to think about patriarchy as a system that is independent of capitalism or other systems of production. In terms of the first very important question about the Global South, I mean, most of my macro modeling work has been done in the context of the Global South global South countries and the challenges of development. I didn't get to talk a lot about it in this particular panel, but I also think, as you emphasize, that there's a lot of diversity in the global South, right? It's not just one situation, but you brought up a very challenging prospect, which is how to apply this kind of analysis, or the utility of this kind of analysis, in the context of violence and conflict in particular. And that's something that is very challenging, and my work has not addressed that, although it has addressed the different manifestations of patriarchy across different countries and how that interacts with sort of standard macroeconomic structures and conditions of growth. So one example might be countries that are very plentiful in natural resources, right, have not had the same kind of increases in women's labor force participation as countries that have fewer natural resources. And one of the consequences for that in terms of social norms is that there has not been the kind of indigenous, or not indigenous, but I'm getting jet lagged here, but there hasn't been the kind of grassroots challenge to traditional gender norms because of women's not increasing their labor force participation, so higher persistence of traditional family structures despite increases in wealth. That's an example of that kind of application. Sorry to take so long.
The first challenging question about, how does any of this relevant to countries which are in disintegration and conflict? It's a good question. You can pose it to any kind of economics. How is any of the kind of economic analysis and modeling and data work and theory done by people in this conference, how does it help us when we're talking about social breakdown, war, and violence? I think we've got some sessions on conflict and inflation, but I'm not sure even they're really talking about what happens when we have got actually a complete depletion. I mean, this is where I would refer to my concept of depletion of human capabilities. We're talking about countries which are suffering a most extreme depletion of human capabilities. So first we have to name that and say, this is what's happening, and it's not something that can easily be recovered from. And then we have to think about why is it happening, and then we have to think about what kinds of policies would we advocate for, and what are the barriers to those policies actually being implemented. There are huge, huge barriers. So I think that's why I find useful about thinking about the depletion of labor. I mean, it's a macroeconomic way of trying to frame this, because that's what we were asked to talk about in this session, about macroeconomics as an object of consideration. But I think that linking it to the devastation, the breaking of the social fabric, and the depletion of labor in terms of thinking about it in macroeconomics, I mean, the destruction of human lives is what you're talking about. And that's not something we can easily we're doing our modeling in universities, but removed from those desperate situations of people in Sudan, for instance. But I think, how can we bring our thinking to bear on those kind of desperate situations? So I think I would reach then for thinking about what are the forces driving the depletion of labor? Is there any possibility of recovery? What would be needed for any recovery to take place? And yeah, I think, and the question about patriarchy and growth, I think Elissa's answered that quite a lot. But I think it depends what dimension of patriarchy. I think when talking with Stephanie Seguino and people from South Korea about her work there, it was just, okay, the way to grow in the way that South Korea did. Educate your women, close the gender gap in education, really educate your women, but don't close the gender gap in wages. Keep the wages, the wages of the women low, so as to provide the incentive for the first phase of industrialization. So it wasn't a simple answer because it depended on which kind of dimension of gender inequality you were taking into account.
Thank you.
Oh, well, very briefly, though, while there is the gap you have identified when it comes to countries you named, Iran, Sudan, Pakistan, the positive news is there is actually quite a lot of work that has been done in feminist macro that, İpek Karajan and colleagues for a ILO report that Valeria Escuel has actually really initiated, has looked at 45 countries in the world about the impact of improving the care sector and the working conditions of the care workers and its effect on job creation. So, or if you look at the Levy Institute models, they are applying to countries like Ghana, Kenya, broadly speaking, low-income economies. Gemini have looked at 8 economies for International Trade Union Confederation, and those were including countries like Turkey, Philippines, South Africa, Chile, Colombia, and if I have forgotten one country that's in the paper. Obviously, there is a critical mass of women who work on feminist macro and gender budgeting, for example, from Turkey in this conference. Quite a lot of papers on that. That doesn't still excuse why there is less work that has been done on the countries you have named. The patriarchy-led growth, or is it impeding or enhancing growth? A very good question, Jan. This is what we try to call as gender equality-led growth or gender inequality-led growth. We tried to operationalize it for 2 countries, Turkey and Korea. What we found was actually both were driven by gender equality rather than gender inequality. It depends on the parameters of the economy, sectoral structural features of the economy, including gender structural features, but also other structural features in terms of import structure, oligopoly structure, and so on. What I should though say is, whatever we found, the one finding still remains. Impact of distribution on growth, positive or negative, is always very small. So we care about it, but I started to say improving equality won't impede growth, even if you're in an inequality-led parametric setting. However, it also won't be the drivers of growth. The driver of growth will really come from, I think, investment, and public investment is the locomotive of that. So yes, it's an interesting question. It's neither or because the impact is small. The way to positively formulate it is we can actually fight inequalities, and if we combine it with a massive mobilization, big push in public investment, we can manage all, and we know how to do that, so there is the future. But yeah, while the question is important, and I think I care a lot about your question, the impacts, I think the one thing that we can agree on will always be small. And therefore, we can stop worrying about profit-led, wage-led, gender equality-led, or gender inequality-led. We can achieve equality, and we have to push for public investment to really make everything else work for the economy.
Thank you so much. And with that, we will replenish our labor power for tomorrow.
Oh, she did. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, well, you will finish, you'll discuss this over dinner, because we all are now going to make sure that we are well fed and rested tomorrow and move off to dinner. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you for the very nice sharing with letting us run over 15 minutes.